We are the space robots. We are here to protect you. Back, cooey, uns. Back, cooey, uns. Back, cooey, uns.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Pusher Robot.
And this is the Shupper Robot.
And we are here to protect you
from the terrible secrets of space.
Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Our topic today is we are talking about observing celestial bodies. We're recording this right now in early December 2019. We were going to try to do this when the Mercury Transit was fresh in everybody's memory.
If you got the chance to see it, at least.
Yeah, we'll talk about that first. I know I went out and tried to observe it with just a set of decent binoculars and a photo or a solar filter. That did not work, as you might imagine, because Mercury is very, very small.
Yes. When you compare it to the sun, it's pretty dang small. Even the transit of Venus is pretty minute compared to the sun.
Like, you really got to have a decent optical setup to get good visuals on it. Mercury transits, I mean, everybody was making it out to be a pretty big deal, and it kind of is. It only happens about 13 times every century, give or take. There are some mitigating factors that'll throw it to a little more, a little less, depending on how things go. When it comes to the inner planets, Mercury and Venus, and even the moon with solar eclipses and stuff, the big question that keeps getting asked is, why is this such a rare phenomenon? Like, shouldn't the moon eclipse the sun once every 28 days on its orbit around the sun, and shouldn't Mercury and Venus eclipse the sun, every time that the Earth, either overtakes or is overtaken by them as we're all transiting around the sun? Because you look at those nice solar diagrams and, everybody's in the same plane all the time, or at least that's what it kind of looks like in those diagrams.
Yeah, and if the solar system was as flat as a pancake with zero axial tilt, you would be right. And you would see transits all the time. It would be really cool. There'd be lots of eclipses of everything. But unfortunately, as the Pusher Robot mentioned, we have that thing called axial tilt and orbital inclination. Darn it, physics. Why couldn't you just make things perfect and nice?
So Mercury specifically is tipped by about 7 degrees to us. So we do get it to where, in quotes, Mercury is in between Earth and the sun. But it is oftentimes, from our perspective, above the sun or below the sun. That's why you don't see it crossing the sun. Same thing with Venus. It is also tilted with respect to the Earth's transit. So it'll be above the sun or below the sun when it is, quote-unquote, in between the Earth and the sun. So that's why they're such a rare phenomenon. That's why they're so cool, is, you only see them once in a while. When you do, it does give you an amazing opportunity to see the planet in kind of a new way.
Yep, and I totally missed it like a giant scrub.
Oh man, that's rough.
Thank goodness, though, there are some awesome recordings if you want to go and refresh your memory.
We'll probably have some links in the description. So moving on from our close neighborhood to a more broad thing, obviously the only 3 celestial bodies really that we can see transiting in front of our own sun is Mercury, Venus, and the moon, because nothing else really gets in between us and the sun. So how do you go from that to detecting planets that are, not only not in between Earth and the sun, but to detecting bodies that are, outside of our solar system and in other galaxies even? Like, there are a bevy of tools that astronomers have figured out to detect these bodies, and we have several here. These are all pulled from NASA JPL. They have an excellent set of resources for learning about these technologies. We're going to summarize them here.
Yes, extrasolar bodies, though, one might say could be considered heresy back in the day. But let's talk about that for a second. Just an interesting tidbit of history. As you know, Copernicus once thought that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos and that it circled the sun. That was not a very popular opinion, but when he published his theory, he wasn't murdered because he published his theory literally on his deathbed. He was just like, oh, and by the way, guys, the Earth's not the center of the universe. This is what I believe. Right around 1584, an Italian by the name of Giordano Bruno believed, going on from Copernicus's model, that certainly other stars existed and they must have planets revolving around them, the way that the Earth circles around the sun. Unfortunately, he was not as tactically wise as to publish his theories on his deathbed, so he was condemned as a heretic and burned alive at the stake in the 1600s. But from that is how the idea of planets being out there around other stars came to be.
Indeed. There's five-ish main ways that we use to observe extrasolar bodies. Each of these techniques are not a one-size-fits-all deal. These different techniques kind of layer on top of each other and help to provide additional evidence for exoplanets specifically, but other bodies that we can see. Scientists often use multiple ones to determine not only the size and the mass and the position of bodies, but also, in some cases, their general composition, and most importantly to us, I guess at this stage, is whether or not they have an atmosphere, and possibly even what is that atmosphere made out of. Number one is going to be radial velocity. So this is useful when we're looking at a solar system that is what we're going to call side on to the Earth, which means that the orbital plane is, you're looking at it from the side, so you're not seeing, circles, you're just seeing lines back and forth. When you're looking at a star in the center of a solar system, if there's a big enough object that is orbiting around it, it's not the simplistic model where the star is, uniquely fixed at the center of the solar system and everything else revolves around it in a perfect circle. The masses of the planets are pulling the star back and forth, kind of like the moon pulls the tides. That makes the star kind of jitter side to side, just doot, 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 doot.
Yeah, they jitter a little bit, and also, as you know, like in a two-body system just simplified, they orbit a common center of mass. Now, generally speaking, stellar masses are orders of magnitude larger than a planetary mass, and so it usually is somewhere close to where the star's normal center of mass is for its orbital plane.
When you have multiple large bodies orbiting the star, it's definitely going to wobble in a weirder way. And this technique is really useful for determining kind of the mass or the overall mass of bodies orbiting a star, because you can generally tell based on certain characteristics of the star, color, distance, size, that kind of thing. You can generally tell what the mass of that star is. So based on how much it's wobbling, you can tell, what the mass of the thing making it wobble is, because those equations are fixed. This, of course, only works up to about 100 light years away from Earth, because after a certain point, the resolution on our telescopes becomes so insufficient for determining these minute wobbles of stars. And they are really minute, unless you're dealing with a star orbiting another star, or a black hole orbiting a star, or, a star orbiting a black hole or something. So if you're talking about just a wispy little, Jupiter orbiting the sun, then the sun is not wobbling a lot because of that Jupiter.
Right. And you may be asking yourself also, how do I see a star wobble? I'm out there looking with my fancy smancy telescopes and I see no dancing stars in my sky tonight. Well, also another tool in the astronomer's bag is going to be utilizing the Doppler shift of the spectrum of that star. So that being a blue shift, if the star is moving towards the Earth, or the observation point, or a slight red shift, that is the light coming away is going to be more towards the red shift of the spectrum than it naturally would be. And you can actually plot that information over time, and you'll actually get a nice little curve that'll show you the star wobbling back and forth.
So that is the principal method that you hear about a lot. That is kind of a easy catch-all for our close neighborhood of how do we detect planets or potential planets in that area. Once we kind of have some candidates, then the next thing that we try to do is what's called transit photometry, which also only works with edge-on solar systems. Note that none of this stuff is going to work really well for top-on solar systems where you're looking at the orbital plane from above, because the star is going to be, jittering and rotating, but there's not going to be any Doppler shift. For transit photometry specifically, you're not going to have any cases of what is kind of like a distant Mercury transit, where the celestial body is transiting in front of the star from the Earth's position. That's going to work in a more broad sense of dark body moves in front of light generating body, so we get less light.
But another cool thing about transit photometry is you can also get spectrograph information about that planetary atmosphere. So, you're looking at the star, and you've got the light coming from the star, and you have a decent idea what that absorption line spectrum looks like, and then you get that planetary transit, that absorption line will change, and you can actually figure out, hey, that planet happens to have a sodium-rich atmosphere, and I can tell by looking at my handy-dandy spectrum graph here, which is an awesome tool for figuring out more about those planetary bodies.
And this transit photometry complements radial velocity in the sense that radial velocity can tell you the mass of a body, and transit photometry can tell you the size and, in some cases, the composition of a body. So between those two pieces of information, you get a really good idea of the type of planetary or other object that you're looking for. Perhaps it's a large alien spaceship, who knows? So those two work pretty dang good. But for stars that are much more distant, we have to use other techniques, and one of those is called microlensing. And this one is weird because this technique relies a lot on kind of general relativity in a certain sense. It involves the bending of light around supermassive objects. So the basic points that you need to know is you've got a star that is very, very distant and very, very bright. And we know the brightness of it, it's quite constant. Then you have another star pass in between Earth and that large star in the distance, or that very bright star in the distance. And this closer star we call the lensing star. When this lensing star passes in between Earth and the far point source star, the light from that star is going to bend around the closer lensing star. And that is going to be at a predictable and calculable constant rate based on what we can observe from the lensing star before and after the transit. But if there is another body orbiting the lensing star, we're going to actually get a brightness increase, because not only is the light going to bend around the lensing star, but it's going to bend around the planet or other celestial body as well. So we're going to see an inconsistency with the calculations that we would have made, assuming that the lensing star had no bodies orbiting it whatsoever. So the upshot of this is that we can observe incredibly far away stars for the potential of bodies orbiting them. The downside is that you can really only do this once, because it's very unlikely that, stars pass in front of each other in an observable situation like this, and it's a nigh impossibility that within 100 human lifetimes that you're going to see a star pass in front of another star more than once, or, the same two stars pass in front of each other more than once. Like, it's just not going to happen. So you really only get to make those observations one time with this technique.
It also allows you to play around with some interesting physics, which don't ask me to explain the exact details of how it works. That'll come in a later episode when we explore the craziness of relativity and all that is higher dimensional physics. Which we're definitely not. But are we really qualified to talk about anything? To be honest, about to lose my job. Anyway.
All right. Let's keep rolling through this list here. The next one is kind of a controversial one, and that is astrometry. That is the calculation of a planet through observing, facts about the surrounding bodies. So this is the complement to radial velocity that will work with a top-on view of a solar system. And these, of course, only work quite close to Earth because of the resolution of our telescopes, because you actually need to physically see the star wobble around in a circle from your top-down view, because there's a planet orbiting it. And then you can try to calculate where the planet is going to be and how massive it's going to be based on those facets. Unlike radial velocity, which kind of works for closer-ish stars, astrometry tends to work better for longer orbital periods and bodies that are farther away from their central star. And the reason because of that is that you want to have a really long wobble of the star, and that way you're able to gather a bit more data in each cycle to feed into your calculation machine. And last but not least is, direct imaging. That is exactly what it sounds like. You see a planet, you take a picture of it. It is rarely ever used for exoplanet research because it has to be a really close star system that you can potentially resolve down and catch a glimpse of a large planet, kind of like you would be looking with an amateur telescope at Jupiter and seeing, the sunlight reflecting off of its moons. And you're like, hey, look, there's some moons there, but you don't see the, dozens of other moons around Jupiter and Saturn all the time because they're just either too small, the light's not hitting them properly. But it is still a technique that can be used for exoplanet research.
And you can also use it, obviously, for looking at stars, and then, binary star systems are the norm in our galaxy. finding their like brown dwarf companions and such and whatnot, if they have a brown dwarf, for instance. Very much a very well used technique is direct imaging for these as well. Now, if you had to use one method, or say one method was the most effective method, at least currently as we know them today, do you know what method that would be? If you guessed transit photometry, you would be right. You see, right now, the Kepler Space Telescope was a NASA space telescope launched in 2009. It's got an aperture size of about just under a meter. Basically, they set it up there to go looking, monitoring the brightness of approximately 100,000 stars. And it's checking for the planetary transits. Uses microlensing a little bit, but when you look at the data that Kepler was able to get, I mean, you're talking about number of new planets discovered was pretty much right around like 20 a year from like 2000 all the way up until like 2007. And then in 2008 through 2010, it jumps up to about 100 a year. 2011, you're getting stuff on the order of 175 planets discovered. We discovered in just 2016 1,284 extrasolar planets. So that's just incredible, and that's just using the technology we've got today.
And speaking of technology that we have today, this seems like a perfect place to segue into this, but the Shovel Robot actually had an opportunity recently to go and visit with an astronomer working at the McDonald Space Telescope in Texas, if I'm not mistaken. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Trevor?
Sure. Yeah, I was in Texas for some work business stuff. And went on for a little road trip, decided that 8 hours was definitely worth the drive to go to Fort Davis, Texas. Visited this awesome telescope setup, and I met with I basically just talked to them, hey, can I interview one of you guys real quick? And they're like, yeah, sure, there's a dude here. His name was Stephen Hummel. He hooked us up with a interview. Hey, space fans, it's the Shovel Robot here with terrible secrets from space, and starting a new segment here called Shover's Adventures, where I go around the world and talk to interesting people about interesting things about space. And today I'm here with Steven at the McDonald Observatory in Fort Davis, Texas, situated up here at like 5,000 feet elevation, tucked away in the hill country or not even the hill country, just the hills of Texas, topped now with some pretty amazing telescopes. The McDonald Observatory is a really awesome place. I'm going to let Stephen kind of give a quick briefing about it. Stephen, what you got?
Yeah. My name again is Stephen Hummel. I work here at McDonald Observatory full time. My job is to kind of serve as a bridge between the astronomers and the public. And here at McDonald Observatory, we just celebrated our 80th anniversary. We turned 80 this year, just a few days ago on May 5th. So we have a long history of having really big telescopes here at McDonald Observatory. Currently, our largest telescope is our Hobby Eberle telescope, which is tied for second largest in the world, or third largest, depending on how you measure it, at 10 meters across. Before that, we had the third largest telescope in the world in the 60s, and then before that, our first telescope, when it was built, was the second largest in the world. Never had first, but it was really a blow to us Texans. But yeah, we operate enormous telescopes, and we have extremely dark skies.
That's amazing. So you said it's 10 meters across, the main reflector?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, what kind of telescope is that?
So the Hobby Eberle telescope is unlike any other telescope in the world, except save maybe one in South Africa, which is literally built from its blueprints. So it's like a clone in the southern hemisphere. But the Hobby Eberle telescope it was kind of inspired by the world's largest radio telescope, or I guess formerly, Arecibo in Puerto Rico. And down at Arecibo in Puerto Rico, they have a giant radio dish, 300 meters across, and it's just simply too big to steer and point and move around. So instead of moving the whole dish, they move the receiver. So for our Hobby Eberle telescope, we kind of had a similar idea. We worked with Penn State and two German universities, Georg August University and Ludwig Maximilians University, to come up with a design that was fixed in elevation, so the telescope itself, the mirrors, cannot tilt up and down, but it can spin around 360. So it's fixed at 55 degrees, and it can't look straight up, and it can't look very low. But it can see a donut area of the sky, and we can move the top end of the telescope to see a kind of 18-degree swath. That reduced the cost and weight of the telescope dramatically. So it was built around the same time as the Keck telescopes in Hawaii. Also, there's two of them. There are also 10-meter telescopes. Each one of them costs about $100 million. Ours is now just as big, our Hobby Eberly telescope, and it cost about $20 million.
What a bargain that is. What can you see with a 10-meter reflector?
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't look through a telescope like that. For the most part, we're taking spectra of objects, right? So we can break the light into its component colors and analyze that, a spectrum from stars or galaxies or other objects. We can go extremely deep, extremely fast. So for comparison, the Hubble Space Telescope is about a little under 2.5 meters in diameter. Ours is 10 meters in diameter. Of course, it's the area of the circle, not just the diameter, that's the light collecting area. So the bigger your light bucket, the fainter an object you can see. So one of the big ongoing projects we have with our Hobby Eberly telescope is we're surveying over 1 million different galaxies that are 9 to 11 billion light years away. So we're looking at these little galaxies and seeing them as they were 9 to 11 billion years ago, these tiny little extremely faint objects, and we're measuring how fast they're all moving away from us. And this is part of our HETDEX project. It stands for the Hobby Eberly Telescope Dark Energy Experiment. Basically what we're trying to do is create a giant 3D map of the universe as it was 9 to 11 billion years ago, and use this information to measure the expansion rate of the universe back then compared to what it is now. And we know that the universe is expanding, but we're baffled by the fact that the universe isn't just expanding, it's expanding at an accelerating rate. Whatever is causing it to accelerate, we call dark energy. We don't know what that is yet, but that's what we're trying to figure out with our HETDEX project.
That's fascinating. And of course, this has profound impact on cosmology and astrophysics as far as trying to figure out, exactly how does our universe work at the extreme ends of things, like both very, very small and very, very large universe scale type projects. I always think it's fascinating to think about how, we've gone from thinking about how the universe is, very small to an isolated, almost a galaxy type size thing, to go very, very large and, okay, it's stable, it's not really changing, but then, hey, we found out, no, actually, because of the WMAP, that with that and the microwave cosmic background, yes, not only is our universe expanding, but it is also accelerating.
Yeah. We're essentially following up to WMAP in a way on the Planck satellite that mapped that early stage. So they looked very far back to the first light that was emitted as in the early universe, and we're kind of looking in that sort of in between stage, just after that, but before some of what we see in the closer galaxies. Yeah.
Looking back in time through the sky, because of course, light being a constant speed and things being so far away, that is how long it takes for them to get there. So we are in effect looking into the past. Do you ever wonder the things that you're looking at in the past right now, because that's when those photons were emitted? Do you ever wonder about what they are today?
Yeah. So these galaxies, 9 to 11 billion light years away, they almost certainly don't exist as we see them now. They could be gone entirely or merged with others to be unrecognizable. It's almost certain of that. And because of the expansion of the universe, although it took 9 to 11 billion light years for that light to reach us, they're certainly much further than that now, because new space has been created in between us and them in that time. So in effect, we'll never ever reach them. So yeah, it kind of boggles the mind sometimes. It keeps me up at night.
That is really crazy too, because you think about the speed of light being this really quick thing, and of course with all the science fiction we always try to portray of the speed of light. We need to be able to go faster than the speed of light, and that's, if humanity really wants to go anywhere outside of our solar system, that's almost a necessity. But because of the expansion of the universe too, adds a whole new complication to being able to get around, because as I understand it, as the universe expands, granted it's a long time away from now, say on the scale of several trillion years, because space has moved so far apart that observational astronomers, 13 trillion years from now, will look out and they will think that the universe is just them because everything has moved so far apart. The light itself is so diluted that it can't even be detected.
Yeah. We're kind of lucky in a way that we exist in a time in the universe where we can appreciate how it was in the past. We can see that and see our place in the universe. Granted, it's not easy to see these things. You need a big telescope, but with the fact that we can is we're kind of fortunate in that regard. Because in the future, future civilizations in the extreme distant future will probably not be able to have the information we have now.
It's been a real pleasure talking with you, Stephen. So they've always got really cool things here at the McDonald Observatory. It's open to the public. What days of the week?
We're open every day from 10 to 5:30, but on Tuesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays we have our star parties where you can come look through our telescopes.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to look through those telescopes tonight because I never actually have gotten to look through a massive telescope before, so that's going to be a really cool experience. But I highly recommend if you're in the area of Texas or driving through like I was today to come check this place out because it's you'll learn a lot of cool things and you'll have a really great time. All right, this has been another great experience. First episode of Shover's Adventures. This is Shover Robot.
This is Steven.
And now you've gone
down
the stairs.
So to start pulling this episode in, let's pull it back to maybe a more local observing celestial bodies within our solar system. Now, obviously, we have planets and moons and stuff, but the real big unknown that we're still dealing with today are near-Earth objects. And those are a big topic of observational phenomenon that we are really focused on these days. Specifically because one could come and smack into us at any time and then we'd all die.
It's always embarrassing when you get killed by an asteroid because you didn't have a space program big enough to take care of it, like the dinosaurs. But we have a space program. We just lack the methods to detect objects smaller than, about 500 meters.
So it's estimated that there's probably, 2/3 of near-Earth objects that are 460 feet or larger haven't yet been discovered. And that's just because they aren't in an optimal viewing position, or maybe they are a very long orbital period, so they go outside of, the majority of the solar system, then come screaming back in at a very high speed. Maybe they could be coming at us from the direction of the sun towards Earth, which would make observing them very, very difficult. Because obviously, observing Mercury, which is a small planet size, is difficult enough, but observing something that is 460 feet wide coming directly at us from the sun would be a near impossible task.
Yep, you've got three classes of groups. Essentially, you've got the Apollo, the Amor, and the Aten. And the Aten are going to be more or less the ones that we are going to cross with, as well as the Apollo class of objects. And a more class of objects are just going to be further than the Earth's orbit. So Aten objects are going to be smaller than the Earth's orbit. They have an orbit around the sun, but can cross into Earth's orbit because they're not, as circular, they're more elliptical. And Apollo is right around the same size, and they cross the Earth's orbit in multiple spots usually. And then Amor asteroids are going to be ones that are larger than the Earth's orbit, and most of them do not cross it at all. They're out of our scope. Unfortunately, these chunks of metal in some cases, dirt, gravel, water compounds, ices, and such forth, moving along at speeds undetermined because we haven't seen them yet. Because, gosh darn it, once you get smaller than about a kilometer, just using direct optical methods from the surface of the Earth is very difficult because their reflectivity is so low. You're looking for them, but there's just not enough light out there to detect them.
And that is the main way that we observe near-Earth objects, is the practice of you take a picture of a portion of the sky, and then you take a picture of the same portion a little bit later. Then you look in between the two images, and you see what moved. And if you see a bunch of the background stars or other known phenomenon, and they all move in one direction, but there's this one point of light that's moving maybe in a different direction or is moving at a different speed, then that's potentially a new asteroid that is just floating around out there. That, of course, still only works if you are able to see sunlight glinting off it, because that is the means by which we can directly visually observe some kind of phenomenon, as if there's light bouncing off it. So this does only work if we do have the sun's illumination hitting it in an angle that we can see from our telescopes both on and around the Earth.
Yeah, what we really need are some dedicated space telescopes with a lot of light catching ability around an infrared spectrum. And those would drastically enable us to discover more NEOs. The problem is once you do put a nice fancy space telescope up there, its time is so valued and prized for searching for things other than asteroids that those things are usually kind of lower on the totem pole. But once you start getting into, talking about extraterrestrial resources and stuff like that, there might be a little bit more money and research thrown into that. And I think we've done a couple episodes on this very topic.
We have. Back on the podcast channel. We'll throw another link in the description.
Yeah, look at that podcast channel.
So let's pull it in for our final aspect of this that we want to talk about today. And that is, of course, probably the biggest astronomy-related news story of 2019. Here's our year in review here, and it really only has one entry, and that is the first ever recorded image of a black hole captured by mankind. And that is super freaking rad.
It's freaking amazing. And the most beautiful thing about it is the physics models that we thought a black hole might look like. It actually looked like what we thought it might look like. And that just goes to show you that math and physics are not always right. But in this case, hey, we did a pretty good job of figuring it out.
And so let's talk about why was it so difficult to observe a black hole? Because there's a large portion of you that are like, well, I saw a black hole in Interstellar, and it seemed really, really bright. It had that big old ring of junk around it. And you are correct. If a black hole is consuming a large amount of luminous matter, like it's feeding off a star, or it's going through a nebula or something like that, and it's pulling a lot of matter, and that matter, of course, is being highly compressed, and it's giving off a lot of energy as it's being sucked into the black hole through the event horizon. It does produce a lot of light, and it would be really easy to observe. The problem is we only really know of 2-ish black holes that do that, or that are that big and are currently consuming a large amount of matter. One of them is Sagittarius A star, which is in the center of the Milky Way galaxy. The other one is M87 star, which is at the center of, and I'm bad at French, Messier 87. That's probably not even French, but that is a distant galaxy from ours. We do know that there's a black hole in the center because of the physics surrounding the galaxy. It is quite far away. So both of these are incredibly far away from our observation platforms here on Earth. Black holes themselves are not big. Like Sagittarius A star is 4 million solar masses, and M87 star is 6.5 billion solar masses. So they're, mass-wise, gigantic, but they are not terribly large because, black holes.
Yeah, it was incredible. And the way that we actually figured out a way to do it was we basically linked up a whole series of radio telescopes, and using a computer, we were able to link them together, and it effectively gave us a radio telescope the size of the planet Earth, which is about what you need to get the resolution to even begin to come close to realizing something like a black hole in the center of a galaxy. It's an incredible feat. And I think it required an immense amount of data processing, which was made famous by the technician that developed this program to do so.
When we're talking about the black hole, these things are, like I was saying, they're very, very small from our perspective. And I think that the number that gets thrown around is 42 micro arc seconds. That doesn't mean a lot if you don't look up at the sky and have a calibrated, heads-up display that shows you what a micro arc second looks like. Imagine that you are trying to observe in detail an orange sitting on the surface of the moon. And that is the size of the black hole that we're observing here from Earth. So you can imagine that it's going to take an incredible amount of imagery. Like even satellites orbiting our planet with really, really high resolution sensors looking down on the planet cannot see, from low Earth orbit, oranges sitting in parks and stuff. At least not the ones that are commercially available. Maybe the military is a little bit different, but the Hubble telescope is great, but the resolution that we needed to achieve was about 4,000 times the Hubble telescope, even to just get a look at the black hole. You've seen these pictures. They are not what you would call good resolution. Like, these are blurry and vague-ish, but they are images, and, even to get that, you needed 4,000 times better than the Hubble Space Telescope, which is devoid of all atmospheric interference. So we're talking about these radio telescopes on the planet. They're not being actively synchronized, But what they're doing is that they all are pointing at the same area of the sky at the same time, and they, have the synchronized, clocks that everybody gets together before the heist, and they all synchronize their clocks to make sure that they're capturing the data at the right amount of time. These super precise internal clocks, because of course the precision of the data collected is going to be vital to assembling this image later. So they go off and they observe it for a certain time period, and this might sound like a reasonably simple thing, but if you know anything about observing from the surface of the Earth, you have a lot of atmospheric effects that you have to account for, either, heat and cold distortion, clouds, over flying airplanes or other satellites that might get in the way of what you're trying to observe. So you're dealing with a planet-wide scale of this kind of coordination where you have to make sure that it's, clear weather and clear, nice, calm air above every single one of these sites at one particular time, looking at one particular area of the sky. They managed to do this, which is incredible, especially because, you're dealing with budget considerations as well. Operating this many telescopes at the same amount of time is consuming a huge amount of money, and they can only afford to do this every once in a while. So they managed to snag it and take a picture of this thing. The amount of data that they collect is in excess of 5 petabytes of data, which is a lot.
That's like a half a ton of hard drives is how much that runs out to, and like what they actually utilize to capture the data, which is incredible. Again, like you mentioned, it's such a noisy place, the Earth, and these are radio telescopes, which are not using optical sensors. But just imagine all the radio just noise completely surrounding and just bathing the Earth in all the random crap that we've got going on. And it's just incredible to think that we were able to sync up the information from these telescopes. And scientists like MIT's, Katie Bowman, I hope I pronounced that correctly, they developed algorithms and programs to be able to actually seamlessly integrate those data sets using all of that, half a ton of hard drive data.
And, we mentioned the weight specifically because this data isn't being transmitted over the internet or over any wireless connection. We're talking about telescopes like in Antarctica that are collecting some of this. So they don't exactly have broadband Wi-Fi out in Antarctica. So these data sets were all thrown onto physical disks, and they were shipped to the central location where they were processed, because that would be just way faster than trying to transfer them over whatever data links we had around the world. And that amount of bandwidth that would be necessary to get them all into one place is just not feasible. So it's just one of those cases where, physically shipping the data ends up being more usable and user-friendly than transmitting it over some kind of internet or wireless signal.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to think about how much bandwidth that would have required.
Yeah, so they get all this in the same spot, they run the algorithm on it, and then boom, we get the image of the black hole that we got here in 2019, which was just an outstanding scientific achievement, and we're just rocking on over here because of it. So, but that pretty much captures the current state, or at least at a basic, high-level overview of observing extrasolar bodies or observing bodies even inside of our solar system. It's a fascinating topic. Highly encourage you guys to check out some of the links we're throwing down in the description if you want to read some more about this. And if you like what you're hearing right now, you like what you're seeing, definitely don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You guys have been on YouTube. If you're watching this video, you know what a YouTube is, probably more than we do. So we will hopefully have some more content here for you shortly. But until that point, ladies and gentlemen, I have been the Pusher Robot.
And I have been the Shover Robot.
And you have gone
down the stairs.
Because I'm all about that space travel. I'm all about that space travel. I'm all about that space travel. I'm all about that space.